They called her a bride. But Evelyn never felt like one. No celebration. No music. Just the weight of fabric she didn't choose. And a future she never asked for. At 17, she stood inside a cottage that smelled of wet wood, burnt rosemary, and regret. Tonight wasn't hers. It belonged to her father's debts, her mother's silence. And a man she'd never spoken to before that day. This wasn't a wedding. It was a trade. The bedding was folded neatly, like a parchment waiting to be signed. Not for comfort, but for evidence. Her mother had whispered instructions. Be still. Don't speak. Obey. Then she had stepped out and closed the door. Outside, men were laughing, drinking, waiting to hear what they called proof. Evelyn's body wasn't her own anymore. It was a stage. And the village was the audience. The door creaked again. He stepped in. Older, red-faced from wine. Not angry, not gentle. Just silent. He untied the cords at his waist. Evelyn didn't cry. Not because it didn't hurt. But because she knew no one would come. Outside, someone struck a pot with a wooden spoon. The cheers began. Inside, Evelyn shut her eyes. And disappeared. Because in medieval Europe, a girl's first night didn't belong to her. It belonged to tradition. To silence. To the men who believed that obedience was purity. And purity was proof. This wasn't romance. It was ritual. They told her this was tradition. That every girl before her had stood in the same room, on the same night, waiting. But Evelyn knew this wasn't about tradition. It was about silence. The kind of silence that filled the room so completely. You could hear the crack of wood. The flutter of the candle. And the beat of your own heart, pounding like a warning. She was 17. But tonight, she wasn't a daughter, or a child. She was a sealed promise. A body traded for status. A name carried on blood and fear. They had dressed her in her grandmother's shift. Its sleeves too long, its fabric yellowed with time. It smelled of smoke, and rosemary, and fear. The bedding had been folded precisely, placed like a stage behind her. Not for comfort. For proof. Because this wasn't a private night. It was a public expectation. Outside, villagers pounded pots and cups. Singing drunken songs they wouldn't remember by morning. But Evelyn would remember. Because she could hear them waiting. Waiting for the sound. The moment. The confirmation that she had been taken. And that the family name had been secured. He didn't speak when he entered. He didn't smile. He simply closed the door, and began untying the cords at his waist. The candle burned lower. The shadows stretched longer. And Evelyn stood still. Until the silence swallowed her whole. This wasn't love. This wasn't celebration. This was survival. Dressed in lace and sealed with blood. The church had rules. And they were written in ink, blood, and fear. Desire was a threat. Pleasure was a path to damnation. The body wasn't a gift. It was a battlefield between heaven and hell. And so, strict laws were carved into the lives of even the poorest peasants. Only one position was allowed. Only on approved days. And never for joy. Desire wasn't love. It was danger carved in wood and stone. 50 days a year. That's all a married couple was permitted. Lent? Forbidden. Sundays? Forbidden. Pregnancy? Definitely forbidden. Not even eye contact was safe. Saints warned that to look at your spouse with longing could corrupt your soul. Even in marriage. Guilt stood taller than grace. Husbands confessed their temptations. Wives confessed their dreams. And the priest would tell them, the body must obey the spirit, not the other way around. So they fasted. They wept. They waited. But deep down, something always stirred. A longing they were told to fear. A touch they were told to forget. Because in the church's eyes, love was sacred. But touch was dangerous. They mapped the female body with fear. Not fact. In the minds of medieval scholars, a woman wasn't whole. She was a reflection of what she lacked. Men were complete. Women were the missing piece. They said her womb could move, drifting like a ghost through her chest, choking her breath, twisting her emotions, causing madness. She was treated as fragile and dangerous, often both at once. If she cried, she was cursed. If she laughed too loudly, she was sick. If she asked questions, she was a threat. The womb, they said, was to blame. Restless, wandering, hungry for seed or smoke. Cures were handed out like commandments. They didn't ask what hurt. They burned it out. Smoke under the nose? ashes rubbed on the skin, chains to hold her still while the prayers were whispered. She was never healed. She was silenced. Because in their world, if a woman didn't fit the script, they rewrote her body until she did. They met in the forest, where no priest would follow. They called them moon women, mothers, widows, healers. They knew which roots bled and which ones soothed, which leaves ended pain, and which ones ended possibility. By firelight, they passed down secrets. In whispers. In codes. Because knowledge like that could get you killed. Their wisdom wasn't taught in monasteries. It was written in symbols, pressed between leaves, tied in string, and hidden beneath the hearthstones. They believed the moon controlled the womb. That timing was power. That intention mattered. Pennyroyal, tansy, mugwort, steeped in water, sipped in silence. These weren't potions. They were protection. She poured the tea with shaking hands, not out of guilt, but out of fear, because even knowledge that saved lives was called heresy if it came from a woman. And so these secrets lived in the dark, passed from hand to hand, heart to heart, until the right moment, or the wrong person found out. And then, the fire took everything. She pricked her finger, and let the lie bleed slowly onto the cloth. It had to look real. Real enough to fool the midwife. Real enough to calm her mother's trembling hands. Real enough to prove that she was still worthy. Because in her village, worth was white linen, stained red. A girl's private moment became a public show. The sheet would be lifted, raised above the crowd. The color inspected. A cheer meant celebration. Silence meant suspicion. And suspicion meant punishment. Sometimes, the stains were real. Sometimes, they were staged. But no one asked questions. They only watched. They studied the body, but never understood it. The hymen was seen as a seal, a gate, a proof. They believed if it wasn't broken, she was pure. If it was, she was ruined. No matter how wrong the science was, the judgment stayed the same. To bleed meant honor. To not bleed meant shame. And so, girls learned how to paint stories on linen, before the world painted them as ruined. They said marriage was sacred, but they never let you have it alone. Doors were thin. Walls were shared. Secrets didn't stay secrets. If the couple didn't produce proof, the whispers would begin. A neighbor, a priest, a midwife, all ready to question what happened, or what didn't. What began as a union could end as an interrogation. The church didn't wait for rumors. It demanded answers. Were they faithful? Were they pure? Did they complete the act? Each word recorded. Each hesitation marked. They weren't looking for truth. They were looking for guilt. Confession wasn't for healing. It was for harvesting secrets. A woman whispered her pain through a wooden screen, while a man with ink and judgment wrote her shame down like scripture. And if she hesitated, they'd press harder, because in their world, a quiet bedroom was suspicious, and a woman's silence was never her own. They drew the rules, as if love could be diagrammed. Only one way was right. Only one position. Only one purpose. Everything else, a sin, a sickness, a shadow trying to pull your soul from God. There was no room for pleasure. No space for exploration. Only repetition and repentance. But outside the church, people told different stories, hidden in laughter, tucked between rhymes. Minstrels sang tales of women riding knights, of priests with secrets in their own beds. The peasants laughed, not because it was comedy, but because it was rebellion, wrapped in jokes. Their truth survived. A flicker of candlelight, a knowing glance, a game played behind locked shutters. Sometimes it wasn't about breaking the rules. It was about bending them, just enough to feel human again. Because even under the weight of judgment, the heart still whispered, the body still remembered. And some nights, that was enough. They said it was a demon, sitting on your chest, holding down your breath. The weight would come at night. Not loud, not violent, just heavy. You'd wake frozen, eyes open, and know something else was in the room. Not imagined, not dreamed, real. Priests called it spiritual attack, the work of night spirits, or punished thoughts brought to life. They lit candles, read scriptures, burned herbs, and prayed until the fear left the room, or the woman stopped speaking. Sometimes both happened at once. The books told of creatures who slipped through sleep and touched without hands. They had names, drawings, whole chapters dedicated to warning women about what they might invite in their dreams. Because in the medieval mind, even your sleep could be sinful. Even your thoughts could be possessed. And if you woke up afraid, they told you it was your fault. Once a month, she disappeared. Not by choice, but by rule. They called it unclean. They said the blood made her dangerous, that it could spoil food, kill crops, or drive animals mad. So they sent her away, to a hut near the woods. No fire, no company, just a blanket, a bowl, and the weight of her own body betraying her. Balance had to be restored, even if it meant hurting her. To help her, they believed too much blood made women wild. Too little made them barren. So they bled them, leeched them, pressed hot stones against their stomachs. All to rebalance the humors. All to make her body obedient again. She wasn't allowed near the altar, only beside it, kneeling, waiting for forgiveness. She never asked for. They didn't see her cycle as sacred. They saw it as punishment. Something to be endured. Silently, painfully, alone. Because in their world, bleeding was weakness, and womanhood was something to cleanse. She stood still, while strangers measured her like livestock. The cord wrapped around her hips, then her waist, then her wrists. Each mark recorded, each number compared. Her mother watched in silence. Her father stood outside, and the elders nodded, as if numbers could define longing, as if inches could guarantee children. If the body passed the test, the stars would be consulted next. Birth times, moon cycles, planetary alignments, all examined, not for love, but for offspring. A goat sign with a swan sign? Too passive. A fire sign with a water sign? Too volatile. In their eyes, destiny didn't live in the heart. It lived in the sky. She didn't get to speak, but the scroll did. It listed temperaments, traits, warnings. She may be too fiery, too cold, too independent. But none of it mattered. The veil was already being lifted. Because once the stars had spoken, the girl became a prophecy, not a person. She stood alone, in a courtroom built to silence her. She had been harmed, but it wasn't her harm they cared about. They called it a crime. Against her father, against her husband, against the man who owned her. Not her body, not her voice, just property, tampered with. Punishment was swift, but only when the poor crossed lines, drawn by the rich. A noble could harm, laugh, walk away. But if a peasant woman broke the rules, or if her body made the wrong man angry, justice came in cloaks and scrolls. And mercy did not arrive. Her family could only watch, as the law shut the door behind her. She wasn't accused of violence. She wasn't accused of theft. She was accused of dishonor, of existing without permission, because loyalty was demanded from wives, but never from husbands. And silence was the sentence for women who remembered too much. They called it bundling, a test of restraint beneath wool and wood. The girl and boy were placed in bed together, fully clothed, watched, and walled off by a plank of pine, meant to protect virtue. It wasn't about love. It was about control. A final inspection, before lives were legally tied. Some dreamed of courtly love, the kind found only in ink. Knights pledging loyalty to maidens. Forbidden kisses stolen beneath moonlight. Love letters passed in secret. But these were poems, not promises. Fantasy, not future. Because the ink never mentioned what happened after the wedding. Outside, a peasant girl watched a knight ride by, and didn't wave. She knew better. Romance was for scrolls. Reality was firewood, bread, and bearing sons. Her husband would be chosen by survival, not poetry. And she would be expected to love him, whether he deserved it or not. The church called it a spring festival, but the fires told another story. Masked dancers twirled under flower crowns. Flutes played tunes older than scripture, and ribbons spun around maypoles. As the night thickened, and the rules thinned, they called it holy, but it was older than holiness. One by one, couples vanished into the forest, not by order, but by instinct. There were no sermons here, only the rhythm of feet on moss, the hush of branches parting, The quiet of two people, choosing to forget they were being watched. By dawn, half the village was silent, and more than one belly had already begun a new season. Fertility was fed, with bread, fruit, and dance. Loaves shaped like wombs. Pomegranates cracked open beside floral etchings. Honeyed wine poured on stones, once used in older names. The priests looked the other way. The villagers bowed in prayer. But the earth knew. This was not a sacrifice. It was a celebration. They didn't ask how life was made. They believed the sky whispered it first. The moon wasn't just a light in the dark. It was a midwife. A gendered compass. Wane too early, and the child would be cursed. Conceive on a full moon, and it would be a boy. At least that's what they said. But when the stars lied, the mother was blamed. Books were filled with charts. Neat rows of predictions. That turned hope into pressure. If the child was weak, they said she hadn't prayed enough. If it was a girl, perhaps she had eaten the wrong herbs. If she couldn't conceive at all, they whispered it was divine punishment. There were no medical tests. Only judgment. Desire was supposed to be sacred. But women paid the price. When myths became medicine, they were told that conception required joy, that their body had to want it. And if life didn't grow, they were called cold, or cursed, or worse. These were not tales told by grandmothers. They were rules, etched in ink, enforced by power. And so, generation after generation, women carried the weight of life's mystery, without ever being allowed to question it. She entered the chamber to whisper her shame, but she left it marked by silence. Confession was supposed to be safe, but for many, it became a trap. She spoke her thoughts, her fears, her memories from one dark night, and the priest didn't offer prayer. He took notes, because behind the curtain of forgiveness, they were building lists. They wrote down every detail, not to forgive, but to remember. What was touched, what was thought, what was felt. Even in dreams, the scrolls grew longer, the ink darker, the sins more creative, and more feared. Some of them never happened, but fear didn't need proof, only rumor and ritual. Inside cathedrals, justice wore robes, and punishment echoed like hymns. The Inquisition came not just for heresy, but for sins of the body. Whispers became charges, charges became trials, and trials became sentences. Some confessed under pressure. Some didn't live long enough to confess at all, because in a world where even thoughts had weight, the greatest sin was being seen. It wasn't written in books. It was passed from hand to hand. A folded scroll, a whispered warning, a symbol drawn in the dirt and quickly wiped away. The men had laws, the priests had pulpits, but the women had each other. And that was enough to keep the truth alive. In places too small for sermons, knowledge glowed under moonlight. Books bound in cloth, drawings of roots, stars, and cycles. Notes scribbled in margins beside stains of dried tea and earth. This wasn't rebellion. It was remembering. Of what soothed. Of what ended pain. Of what kept daughters from repeating their mother's silent wounds. Not all teachers stood behind altars. Some sat by fires, whispering truth beneath the crackling wood. Boil this root when your back aches. Never trust a man who won't meet your eyes. God is watching, but so are the trees. No ink, no records, only memory, carried like a prayer, from one mouth to the next. In narrow alleys, women waited, not hidden, but catalogued. They wore red, or green, or yellow. Each color told a story, of permission, of punishment, of property. These weren't houses of shame. They were licensed, inspected, recorded, because control was more profitable than morality. Iron could be locked around love, not to protect, but to possess. They called it purity, but it was punishment. Rusted hinges, narrow slits, belts that dug into skin, to remind her who she belonged to. No proof exists they were widely used, but the fear of them was. Sometimes control didn't need to be worn. It only needed to be imagined. Behind thin veils and thick symbols, a woman was defined. Before she spoke, widows in black, brides in white, workers in red. One glance, and the world decided what she was worth. She could pray, she could wait, she could bleed, But she could not escape what she wore. She sat where they told her to, hands clenched around a cross she never chose. The candles had burned low, the linen folded, the watches gone. But the silence that remained was louder than any hymn. It wasn't just her wedding night. It was a rite, a ritual, a moment dressed in sanctity, built on centuries of control. The door creaked open, not just into the room, but into history itself. She didn't rise. She didn't speak. She didn't cry. Because what waited on the other side was never just a man. It was 1,000 years of expectation, a ceremony written by hands that never once held hers. And in the cracked mirror, she saw what they'd created. Not a wife, but a warning. She wasn't being welcomed. She was being shaped, molded, silenced, bound to a myth she never believed. And beneath the firelight, Evelyn finally understood. This night was never about her. It was about the system that needed her silence to survive.